Welcome to New Horizons. I was chatting with George a few minutes ago about how much has happened, and we'll cover that today in our conference. When somebody is diagnosed with cancer, something visceral goes through their body when they hear you have cancer, as opposed to you have poison ivy or what have you. And one of the things that happens is they try to reach out and they look for other people who can tell them, it's going to be okay. And so what Sarah has helped gather together today is we have over 200 representatives, about a dozen speakers from over 25 countries around the world. And the thread that links us all together is that we each give one another hope. And we underestimate in this world sometimes what hope is worth. And it's worth everything. We adopted a mantra when the Life Raft group came into being as well that said, you are not alone. That no matter where you are in this world, whether it is Kenya or Switzerland or India or Canada or what have you, you're not alone. And thanks to the internet and a group of unusual people, in fact, you're not. I would be remiss if I also did not thank today Novartis, Decipher, Blueprint, whose continued support helps to keep us together. I'm not going to take a lot of time. I just want to take this as an opportunity to bring back a group of people, many of whom have known each other for many years, some of whom have known each other for only a couple of days. But we have a brotherhood and a sisterhood of survivors and caregivers that you can't understand unless you're part of it. We share so many defining moments, some of them sad, people that we've lost, some of them glorious, people who have survived. So with that, we the Life Raft Group, we welcome you all. I'm going to turn the cast of characters over to my colleague from GIST Support International, Ginger Sawyer. And Ginger, take it away.
Ginger, you appear to be on mute.
I am off mute, I think now. Thank you, Norman. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce Dr. George Demetri today as our lead-off speaker. He's the director of the Center for Sarcoma and Bone Oncology at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and director of the Ludwig Center at DFCI. Earlier this year, Dr. Demetri was introduced and named as a fellow of the Academy of American Association of Cancer Research. And as I understand it, it's a brain trust for people who've done research in cancer and the therapies for cancer. Not only does he do the research, but he also leads the education effort. And as part of that education effort, he's agreed to join us today. And we're really happy to have you, Dr. Demetri. And I'll turn it to you at this point.
Before we have Dr. Demetri begin, we have a surprise audio clip that we would like to share with everybody. That's from 2002, when Dr. Demetri received an award at our first Life Fest meeting in Boston. Please take it away.
I feel a little bit humbled being here. I feel very humbled because this should not be viewed as one person. I'm here as a symbol of the team that did this. A lot of the people on whom I depend for the work we do just couldn't be here today. Dr. Jonathan Fletcher, Dr. Chris Fletcher, just an enormous number of other people, David Tuvison, Sam Singer. There's a list that goes on and on of the scientists, clinicians with whom we've collaborated just in Boston. Forget about Switzerland, and then also the other parts of the country and the world. So Heikki Jensu in Finland, Chuck Blanke and Mike Heinrich in Oregon, Meg van Meer and Bert Eisenberg in Philadelphia, and then the list goes on and on after that when we start getting into the National Cancer Institute sponsored trials with doctors really all over the country. And so I think sometimes in cancer research in particular, but medical research, there's too much of a focus on one person. And I'd like to try to break that down and say, I'd like to say thanks to all of you on behalf of the entire team, the team that's really helped to do something so remarkable to really change the world based on, honestly, very, very good science and very good clinical application of some of the best insights from scientists. I think my friend and colleague Brian Drucker in Oregon used the Isaac Newton quote when he presented to an audience of 25,000 screaming hematologists in 1999 the first CML data, when it was clear that leukemia patients were responding in unprecedented numbers to this drug. When he said, "If I have seen further than others, it's because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." And I feel the same way. I've had some of the best medical training and best scientific training anyone could have in the world. And it's really allowed me to be here today and to take the fruits of this research and to take the applications and to really put two and two together and have the pleasure of dealing with a team of just fantastic collaborators and moving this field forward so that many of us are here today, some of whom probably would not have been here today were it not for this drug. I wish all of you were my patients. Many of you were trying to come to Boston when there was very limited drug supply, and it was so hard for us because we were trying very hard with Novartis to set up centers, and we had this collaboration set up with Philadelphia, with Finland, with Oregon, so that there would be some geographic parity. And many people who were not my patients, I had to say, I can't get you the drug. You can get it if you go see Chuck Blanke in Oregon, and we had to send you to somewhere else. And I want all of you to know that, in a sense, I consider you all my patients or people in whom I've had a hand in the work that your very good doctors have been doing with you all. And again, it's been a privilege for me to be a part of the team, and I'm so honored to be here today. I'd just like to say thank you all.
Well, wow. Thank you for surprising me with that clip from 2002 when I still had hair. And when, frankly, I just gave my own talk. So you can move on to the next agenda item. Now, just kidding. What I wanted to say was thank you, seriously, from the bottom of my heart. As Norman said, this has been a transformational experience for us all. It's been a transformational experience for patients who get diagnosed. It's been a transformational experience for our field, which still looks to GIST as an inflection point, as a real turning point in how we understood cancer. And that's not a trivial thing. I want to say thank you to all of you for being colleagues and partners, not just patients. You know, I think one thing we started with this was also the whole idea that patients aren't just subjects in research studies. I hate the word subjects. I also hate the word providers for physicians or nurse practitioners or healthcare professionals. I think providers is a somewhat demeaning term. And I think subjects is a somewhat limiting term for people who participate in clinical research trials. You all who have participated in trials and who may need clinical trials in the future, you're partners in our research. We are all in this together. All of us are just pre-patients. Let's be honest, we're all human. So I wanted to say first and foremost, thanks to all of you for forming this community. And I was really honored when Norman and Sarah offered me the chance to help kick off this meeting and give just some sort of old mannish type look back on the field commentary. And I won't, you know, I debated, should I make slides? Should I give my standard talk? And I said, no, absolutely not. I don't want to do that. What I'd rather do is share some more of the insights in the next, let's say, 15 or 20 minutes, and then actually open it up for some discussion or questions or dialogue with you before you move on to the next thing. I know time is limited. I do want to show one slide if I can, though. So let me see if I can pull this off and share my screen, because I think it will help you all to see where I'm coming from. Let me just now make this one bigger. And if I'm not mistaken, you should be able to see that. You see a bunch of horses, right? Shake your head up and down, Sarah, if you see that. Okay.
Yes.
So this is what people think of as cancer. We thought of cancer as this sort of out of control, roaming group of horses, buried, knocking down fences and all this. This was sort of the view of all cancers in the 1970s. I was a medical student in 79, and even the 1980s, when all we had were kind of dumb, brute bat force to hit things over the head and hopefully control the cancers. And then we started to get smarter and realize that not all cancers were alike, but some cancers were more uncommon than others, right? Because let's say the dark brown horse is a breast cancer, the lighter brown horse might be colon cancer, the whitish horse is lung cancer, but people with sarcomas were viewed as zebras. And in the 1980s, we used to have these meetings every week to go over the various kinds of these tumors called sarcomas, of which literally now we think there are thousands. And this one type that started in the gastrointestinal tract was particularly nasty, and it never responded to any kind of therapy. And the pathologists were like old school wizards who would say, well, this is a nerve-like disease that might be a nerve-like gist, and this is a muscle-like gist, and this is a gist that we can't tell what it wants to be. And I'm going, you guys really don't understand this at all, do you? And they said, nope, we really don't. The honest ones would say, nope, we really don't. But the bottom line is eventually we got enough of understanding so that we could collect the zebras. And I think together change the world, because we realized that not all sarcomas were GIST, but surprisingly, this disease called GIST, which could be enriched by new molecular tools, turned out to be the most common type of sarcomas. And it was one of the key things that allowed us to get this work done. The most important thing was the teamwork. And I want to emphasize right now, I still feel that to this very day. I feel that academia is completely off track. Academia is a star system of individuals, and sometimes the ones with the sharpest elbows who can knock others out of the way are the most successful. And what I found is that if you can bring the best people together, you have the best chance of really making a difference. An old African saying, as many of you probably know, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go in a group. And that's what we've done. We, together with some of the best scientists, some of the most dedicated professionals in healthcare, and some of the most dedicated professionals in various corporate entities like Novartis, like Pfizer, before they even knew they were going to do it, when we had guerrilla warfare with them. We really started working together with you all as advocates and patient groups that were really trying to then talk to the various regulators, FDA, European Medicines Association, and of course the payers in various countries who sometimes made really dumb decisions. And we got things done. So I want to stress, you guys all know the history of this drug. Hopefully it was one very interesting story where Novartis had this drug. Brian Drucker shared a scientific insight that the KIT mutation that Japan had, some investigators in Japan had noted to be probably the driver, at least one of the key drivers in GIST. And they noticed that this KIT mutation turned on the KIT enzyme, and the rest is history. If we could shut it off, Brian Drucker said, hey, the drug I'm working on, leukemia, could shut this off. And I said, cool, why don't you do that? Get your Nobel Prize. He said, no, I'm busy with leukemia. You know GIST, you know sarcomas. You take this on, look after my buddy, Chuck Blanke, and go do this. So Brian was the first to show his depth of feeling and generosity and the kind of teamwork, because many academics would have said, thank you so much, I'll do this too, I'll do more, and I'll get my Nobel Prize. Brian didn't care about that. Brian cared about helping patients, and he still does. And our team, the team we assembled, I still remember the meeting we had really after the very first patient was treated in Finland, where we, with Novartis, got together and said, okay, let's try to work together. We formed this group between Boston, Finland, Philadelphia, and Oregon Health Science University in Portland, Oregon. And we formed a great collaboration that then went global, even more and more national. So with that, we really plowed some new ground. We plowed new ground in terms of the pathologists really revising their diagnoses. Norman was right on target when he said we had the internet. This was an unusual time when I called up the guys who started Google. I called up the original 2 Google guys and I say, hey guys, we have kind of a public health emergency going on because we know that at least half of the patients with this disease that this drug will help don't know they have the disease. And we're going to try to get them to pay attention and bring it to the attention of their doctors who might revise their diagnosis. And I said, would you guys try to fix this? If somebody searches for leiomyosarcoma, would you have GIST information come up? They said, we have enough faith in our algorithm. Let's see what it does in the next week or 2. So I never really know if they ever changed anything, but literally we were pinging the algorithm every week. And a week later, we started pinging leiomyosarcoma and GIST information came up. So people were starting to learn that if they had a leiomyosarcoma diagnosis, they should question authority, bring it to their doctor and say, hey, could you maybe see if I might have this other disease? And remarkably, the diagnostic pathologists around the world, this resonated with them. They said, cool, we didn't know what we were doing anyways. You mean there's another way we might make a better diagnosis and it might be tied to a breakthrough therapy like this? So the worst disease, this disease called GIST, was the disease no patient, not even any sarcoma patient, wanted to have in around 1985 or 1986. But by even 1997, things hadn't changed. And now in the year 2000, it really became the disease everybody with a sarcoma wanted to have. So we had to really make the diagnosis, and the diagnostic community of pathologists rose to the challenge. And within a couple of years, we were seeing a huge drop in any kind of misdiagnosis rate. So that was good for patients, but I also thought it was because patients kind of started to take control of their own future. Not in a nasty way, but in a way that said, hey doc, there's no reason you should know about this rare disease, but there's every reason I should know about it. And even people who weren't internet savvy, they might have somebody in their family who raised it to them. You know, children, grandchildren would say, hey grandma, did you see this? I saw it on the internet. I saw it on AOL or something like that. So they would be getting these interesting things and start to change the field in a respectful way. It was also a wonderful time of alignment. I can criticize academia for being too much affiliated with the STAR system and for disincentivizing teamwork, but I can also criticize industry for sometimes being a little bit too focused on profits over patients. But here was a great time. Novartis was a company that had priced Gleevec, or imatinib, the original name was Gleevec, as you all know, at a very fair price for the day. I don't know how many of you know this, but Dan Vasella had cancer in his family. Dan Vasella cares about cancer patients, and he was a conservative Swiss, and the Swiss don't like to make trouble. So the last thing they wanted to do was to price this at a ridiculous level that the European authorities would say, that's just unheard of, too high. So when it came out and it had to be priced for leukemia, he said, okay, it looks like a life-saving drug. How much does technology that saves a life cost? And they turned to dialysis. And dialysis cost about $65,000 US a year to keep somebody alive, and every civilized country paid for dialysis. And he said, okay, well, that's a technology, this is a drug. How about if we price it, a little bit less? Let's take $15,000, $20,000 off the top, price it around $45,000, $50,000 a year, which was already kind of a high price, but not a ridiculous price. And it was justifiable in the context of another life-saving technology. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. For those of you who don't know, I've always had an interesting love-hate relationship with industry because I love them. You can't get drugs developed without industry. So we need industry as a colleague, as a partner. But I'm a real fan of working for patients, not for profits. And I am on the board of Blueprint Medicines. I helped get Blueprint Medicines started. And it's been an interesting, eye-opening experience about what it takes to get corporate entities up and running, to get drugs to patients. and to take on the burden of costs that go into the incredibly ridiculously expensive research that it costs to get drugs available to patients around the world. So I've learned a lot, and I've kind of mollified my criticisms of the industry. With that having been said, in the early days of working with Novartis, there was an alignment. They wanted to sell more drug. I wanted to get the drug to the patients in need. So we matched education with marketing. And that's why they started taking out these glossy ads for tens of thousands of dollars in all the medical journals saying, seek it, meaning S-E-E-K in English. That means to look for something, to seek something. But they said seek it. And of course, they were playing on a pun of C-KIT, the proto-oncogene that's mutated in GIST. C-KIT is mutated, seek it, and then you can give Gleevec. So it was a marketing strategy, but it got doctors thinking about looking for this target. And it was one of the first really important molecular targets that doctors had to think about looking for. The first was probably, of course, the famous breast cancer marker, HER2. And I always give credit to the fact that in breast cancer, they've always had good markers. You don't make a diagnosis of breast cancer just by saying you have breast cancer and leave it at that. You say you have hormone receptor positive breast cancer. Or in the late 1980s, you have HER2 overexpressing breast cancer. And that led to the idea that cancers were different and that by knowing what's driving the cancer, we might be able to treat it. And so over the last 20 years, Gleevec has still been one of the paradigms to show that was possible in solid tumors other than breast cancer, and certainly other liquid tumors other than leukemias and lymphomas. One important thing that many of you know is that when Brian Drucker was at Dana-Farber, he got unsummarily dismissed, was fired, because they thought his research would never amount to anything, that there was a prevailing conventional wisdom that the c-Abl fusion, the oncogene that's mutated in leukemia, was not really a driver. And the real hero in the Gleevec story was Oregon Health and Science University, which gave him a little lab and said, keep your work going, we believe in you. And when he told me that it inhibited KIT, and I said, we should test this in GIST patients, everybody said I was wasting my time. It's not going to work. Solid tumors are different than leukemia. You're crazy. We knew you'd never succeed. And it is a marker, again, of just kind of following your passion, being willing to take some risks. And we all did that together. I think when you read the story of Dan DeSola, he was told not to develop Gleevec. Too small a market, too risky. Why would we invest in this? Let's find another breast cancer drug. It's a bigger market. Well, fast forward, I won't go over all the other interesting foibles of being an academic and dealing with the pharmaceutical industry and learning about the biotech industry, but it's been a terrific ride. We had to convince Pfizer along the way, all of us together with other GIST advocacy groups helped convince Pfizer to develop their drug called Sutent. And then fortunately, I didn't have much work to do to convince Bayer that this was a good thing to develop a third drug, Stivarga, or regorafenib, the fourth drug, ripretinib. It took a long time to that one to get developed, but eventually they chose to go their way, and Blueprint finally developed avapritinib for a group that was unrecognized and had no drugs, the PDGF receptor alpha group of mutant GIST patients. And there are more drugs coming. It's so exciting to see some of the new work that's going on. We still have to fight. There's still a fear that this is a small market, but I've kind of learned how to fight for small markets, and we have our work cut out for us ahead. The pressures on the pharmaceutical industry, the pressures on academic research have never been higher, but there's still a lot of money flowing into biotech, and I want to make sure some of it goes to the best research to help people with a disease like this. We are doing very well with about 20% of GIST patients having long-term survival, even in the setting of spread disease, but we're still not giving up on cure. And I want you to know that. This is the C word that we've been hesitant to use in this disease, but some of the most compelling new biotechs that I'm talking to are saying we're going to need combinations for cure. And I do believe that. Now, many of the drugs we have, like Sutent, like Stivarga, don't pair well with other drugs. That just means we need other drugs. So we need to develop these combinations. That sometimes means licensing drugs that somebody else doesn't want because it's too small a market. And it sometimes means maybe knocking pharmaceutical heads together so that we can actually get people to work together for the right reasons. And honestly, the way we've done that is by combining our forces. the best science, the most potent advocacy groups, the best education, and frankly, the best rationale. Pharmaceutical companies aren't evil. They're not. I really don't believe that for 1 second. I think they can be maybe short-sighted, and they certainly have to, they have fiduciary responsibilities, all about investments. Part of why I never went into an industrial job. I didn't want to really be dependent upon returning shareholder value. I am a board of directors member, and I take my fiduciary responsibility seriously with Blueprint. But when they said they weren't going to develop drugs and GIST anymore, I said, you sure? I mean, I think there's really a future there. They said, no, we're not. I tried to argue, and I could say no. And in the end, from a fiduciary standpoint, I understood it. And that's interesting, but it's not my whole life. It's part of why I've stayed in academia, so I can have a different life. I can have the shadow life of being the academic and pushing the research forward. So I want you all to know that we are all here for you, all of us in academia, and frankly, when the time is right, the right people in biotech and biopharma. I also have to comment on our friends at the Food and Drug Administration and other regulatory authorities across the world. They really care about small market diseases. They see the value of true breakthrough therapies. And we do too. I don't want to develop a drug if it only gives people 2 weeks extra control of their disease. That's ridiculous. We like aiming for cure. So we're going to shoot high, and we're going to shoot for big, what we call effect sizes from the drugs we develop. And then the last thing is that data speaks for everybody. Remember, I told you about the payers in the early days making a bad decision. Let me give you this sense. Many of you in the UK know the organization known as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, peculiarly named NICE, because they make the decision about what the UK will pay for patients who have potentially life-threatening diseases like cancer. When NICE looked at Gleevec in the early days, they say, Dr. Dimitri, they called me, Dr. Dimitri, we're willing to pay for this drug, but if patient's disease doesn't shrink, we'll stop paying. Does that sound reasonable to you? I said, no, that does not sound reasonable to me. Those patients are still benefiting. Stable disease is the same benefit as shrinking disease, and you're making a mistake. And in fact, you're going to spend more money because those patients will still need palliative care, and it'll take a while. So why would you do that? I actually said it in much more graphic terms, and I offended them, but I wanted to offend them. I wanted to pay attention. And they said, why would you say that? And I said, well, we have data. We know from our data with Gleevec that people who have stable disease and don't shrink more than 50% have the same benefit in survival. Give those patients the benefit. You should only stop paying if the drug stops working and the disease is getting worse. You should look into that. I shared all of our data with them. It literally took them 8 to 12 months to review it, but they came back to me 8 to 12 months later, and they finally said, okay, we believe you. We looked at your data. We're going to pay for it unless the disease is objectively progressing and clearly getting worse. I say, good, that's the right ticket for patients. And I was proud of that. Of all the things I fought with, I was really proud to make that fight because it really increased access. I think that's the next challenge for patients around the world. How do we access the best therapies? How do we make them affordable? How do we make them doable? That's what insurance is supposed to do. This is a rare disease. Countries can afford the care of this disease because it's so rare, but then we have to be careful that we're not asking for something that's just marginally more effective and hugely more expensive. So we have to be careful what we ask for. But if we can really head for cure, we should be on the same side and convince countries and payers that it's worth it for the patients we all care about. And with that, I think we have a few more minutes. Sarah, I don't know how you would like to do this, but I'd like to throw it open, see if anybody has any comments in the chat. As those of you who know me know, I could go on for another couple of hours, but I'm also respectful of the fact that there's only one of me and you've got a huge agenda in the next day or two.
So we're opening up the floor to questions, and Ginger, I'm gonna have you moderate if any come in.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm looking at a different chat. I don't see anything coming in the chat. You might have a different chat in your.
Yeah, also people can raise their hand. Okay, Ginger, do you see the question that came in? And
I can see that one. I can read this, Ginger. It said,
okay.
What's your opinion on brand name versus generic Gleevec? I actually think generic Gleevec's fine. There is an issue here about generics in general. If you read a book by a very, very good investigative journalist, Catherine Eben, called Bottle of Lies. I would encourage everybody to read this book, but it's something we as society need to pay attention to. We need to look at that because some of our generics of any type, antibiotics, vaccines, Gleevec, they're made in countries that may not have the highest quality standards and may actually lie about their quality standards. Gleevec is a pretty simple molecule to make. The concern is, are there any other impurities in there that could be dangerous? The book Bottle of Lies does not talk about Gleevec. It talks about other drugs, typical high blood pressure drugs and things like that, and calls attention to the fact that the FDA does not have the resources to really evaluate manufacturing in other countries as much as it might. I do think it's something that countries might need to do spot checks on quality, and that might be a reasonable thing. But we routinely prescribe generic Gleevec. We are not concerned about big impurities or big quality problems, and I think it's fine. I think that still branded generics in countries like China, it's why growth companies like Glaxo or AstraZeneca or even Novartis, they see their growth markets often in countries with a lot of people, but not the high drug costs that we have in the US and Western Europe. So I am a fan of generic Gleevec, and it's about time that price came down even more. It's disconcerting when the price of brand name Gleevec kept rising every year, but then when it went generic, it should have dropped longer and faster, and is still in the process of dropping. So I'm a fan of making generic Gleevec as inexpensive as possible and yet high quality. We can do it. Somebody from the UK says, thanks for the history of imatinib and NICE. Yeah, I don't know how public that is, but I don't care. It's a great story and it's all true. So I think it's worth looking at that one. Dipanwita says, it seems you're indicating combination therapy is the future ahead. Are you suggesting as primary therapy or condition stage specific? Honestly, we almost always will have to do the research in later stage disease. Let's be honest, primary disease could be looked at as first metastasis or even adjuvant therapy. Adjuvant therapy is an opportunity to cure people. Even going after the first metastasis might be an opportunity to cure people. And if we need combinations, we're going to have to go there. But since Gleevec alone does great for 2 to 5 years in patients, that would be a very expensive clinical trial to run before you get an answer. And that scares away most biotech and biopharma companies. So it's going to be an interesting strategic challenge about how we get this kind of research done. But there are some clever ways we've thought of, clever ways that others have thought of. And I think the FDA is open to some of this in the future. So just stay tuned to this as you see some of the new drugs that are entering the clinic now and in 2022. These might be better drugs to make in combinations or orthogonal approaches. An easy question, does Kymriah
Dr. Dimitri,
work well? Yes.
Dr.
ahead,
Dimitri, following up on that question, there are a lot of individuals who have been taking Gleevec or imatinib for 3 years or 5 years, and then some decide when they get to the 10-year point, well, I'm going to drop off of it, and then they end up with metastatic disease. How do you respond to patients who are trying to make a choice as to whether to stay on adjuvant imatinib after a long period of treatment?
I basically say it's up to them. It depends how well they're tolerating the Gleevec. Most people who can take it for 5 or 10 years are doing okay, but some people get a little bored with it. They say, yeah, I'm still having a little bit of loose stools. It's annoying. And I say, well, if you don't want to deal with the annoyance, you can stop. But then we have to watch you even more carefully after about 6 months, because if you stop it, there is a chance, as you noticed, Ginger, that the disease could come back in about 6 months to a year to 2 years, as long as they're willing to be watched super carefully. And then if it does come back, then they're on it for lifelong. That's reasonable. I think what's wrong is when doctors in the community say, you've had your 3 years of Gleevec, you're probably cured, you can just stop it. And then they stop looking carefully at the patients. That's a medical error. And I tell doctors, don't do that. In my education, I try to say, you got to watch them even more carefully if they've stopped the drug. So it really also depends what their initial risk was. I mean, if their risk was 90% that it'll come back, that's a situation where the patient might still want to stay on it, but it's still their call. And if their risk was only a 5% chance that it would ever come back, some people take it. But we tend to say, don't even bother at that point. We'll watch you, but you might not even need Gleevec. So it's a very personal decision. I think we always personalize the care of that decision, and there's no way of getting around it. That's why doctors can't be replaced with a simple computer algorithm. We have to interact with the patients and figure out what their preferences are and explain in that kind of a thought experiment what might be best for him or her. Or them,
Thank
to
you.
use pronouns inclusively. So. Okay, somebody asked, does Kymriah work for GIST? It does not. Kymriah is useless against GIST. It's a engineered cell therapy that goes after something that's not on GIST cells at all. Will there maybe be some engineered cells that go after GIST? You betcha. We're working with a scientist here at Dana-Farber to see if we can develop such a tool. And I don't know if we'll be able to do it. It's that much of a challenge, but we'll see. So Pete has a hand up. I'm looking at the, you guys should write all these things down and a bunch of us can answer them later. But Ginger, I see Pete Knox. Why don't you-
And actually, I
you've
think
unmuted yourself.
Oscar.
Yeah, Oscar was
has-
first.
Oh, Oscar was first. Oscar, if you unmute
I'll go
yourself.
after Oscar.
Hello, Oscar. Oscar, you have about 5 seconds before we move to Pete. If you can unmute yourself, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, Oscar goes next. Pete, go ahead.
Okay. So first off, Dr. Dimitri, I just want to say great. In the age of hybrid, that's the word we use all the time now for Zoom. Your approach of working with industry and academia and as a researcher, you are the ultimate hybrid, sir. So thank you very much for doing that. I also appreciate your courage for using the C word for cure. It's good to hear. The other C word you use, though, combination, is what I want to talk about, and it's kind of what someone alluded to. I agree with you. I think that combination treatments are maybe a wave of the future, not necessarily the wave, but a wave of the future. You also mentioned, though, that some companies are very generous as to how they price these models, okay? Some are not. So how are we gonna deal with, and I'm just asking you to, give me your opinion here. How are we gonna deal with that elephant in the room, which is when you combine these treatments, now we may have real big cost structures to deal with. Is there any advice you have as to how we might be able to handle that problem? 2 drugs, 3 drugs may cost 2 times, 3 times as much, which is harder to bear.
Yeah, I actually think there's some really creative economic models kicking around right now in smart companies about how you can price a combination less than 2x each individual drug. In the early days, again, I was on the scientific advisory board of Plexicon, which developed the very first BRAF inhibitor for melanoma, and we were in a race against GlaxoSmithKline, which had a different BRAF inhibitor. And Glaxo, we beat Glaxo, and that drug eventually got sold to Roche. So Roche now has vemurafenib. The Glaxo drug was a Johnny-come-lately, but they had a MEK inhibitor drug. So they had data, and we already knew that there would be likely benefit to mixing a BRAF inhibitor with a MEK inhibitor and putting together. And Glaxo was saying, well, we're second to the party. How about if we just price the doublet at the same price as Roche would price the single drug, which I thought would be a really interesting throw down the gauntlet on drug pricing. They never had to do that for a variety of reasons. But I think as we move forward, I love that kind of clever thinking. And I think we as citizens, we as patients, we as academics, and frankly, industry leaders should step forward and embrace this. Because honestly, if we don't take on this issue of drug pricing, the government will. And honestly, even though I like social safety nets, I don't trust the government to do this wisely. I do not trust any government to do this wisely. I think this should be left to the experts in policy, the experts in pharmaceutical costs, and the experts in academic and medical research at many levels. And also to patient advocates. I think we need a revision of insurance, frankly, so insurance does what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to spread costs out on a big basis so that if one unfortunate individual has a high cost, everybody else pitches in 10 cents and that person's covered. That was the original idea of insurance, and we've kind of missed the boat on how that works. And the insurance companies are making a bundle. I do think we're kind of targeting the wrong people when we focus on the innovative drug sector. And it bothers me that drugs are priced high, but I think when we get to combinations, that will drive a change in the cost and the charge structure. So that's just me. I could go on for hours again about the economics of this. I think it's an important thing for advocacy groups to really educate themselves about, because this is also going to be very country specific. It really is going to be country specific.
Thank you, sir.
A lot of questions over there, but I'm sensitive to the time, and I knew the agenda stopped at 9:40, Sarah. So what do you want to do? You're on mute, Sarah. Sarah, you're on mute. Your mouth is moving.
Actually, you have about 4 minutes left, Dr. Dimitri.
Oh, okay.
Oscar, I think, unmuted himself.
Oh, Oscar, you unmuted. Go ahead, shoot. Oscar, the suspense is getting to me.
Hello?
Go ahead, I got you. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, we'll maybe mute Oscar again, and you
Sorry,
can go
Oscar.
with the question from the chat.
All right, and there's a bunch of chats about the long-term adjuvant questions that keep coming up. I think one of the interesting ones, what opportunities does, I assume this means mRNA. mRNA means messenger RNA, but they wrote memory RNA. That could be an autocorrect issue. Does mRNA have any hopes for treatment, cure, or a vaccine to prevent GIST? I don't think we could do a vaccine, because the thing that's on the surface of most GIST is also on the surface of stem cells that give us the ability to make blood cells. We don't want to get rid of all of those. There's danger to doing that. There are some monoclonal antibodies that are being developed for diseases of the immune system that have that. And it may be that some of those could be ported over to GIST therapy someday. We'll see. There's some exciting stuff. The mRNA is a technology that's new and interesting. It'll change the world in many ways, especially for vaccines, as we've seen with the COVID and flu vaccines. But I don't think that will have a vaccine against GIST. I also don't think a vaccine against a rare disease, frankly, makes a lot of sense. Rare diseases are rare for a reason. Most people don't get them. I think if we really just look for why people get them and focus in on those high-risk individuals, that would be fine. We just don't see any such high-risk individuals, except some people for whom very, very rare families where this runs in families. We've identified maybe about 20 such families in the entire world. So that tells you how rare that is. It's really super duper rare. So all of you, I just want to say one other thing. The head of our American Food and Drug Administration, Rick Pazder, has said publicly that he fears for any rare disease that does not have a powerful advocacy group. And he says that out of two sides of his mouth. He says that because he doesn't like the FDA to feel pressured by advocacy groups, which care about patients, but might not be the most educated. And there's an issue about things like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, about how approving a marginal or possibly not very active drug for Duchenne's, or the recent brouhaha over the Alzheimer's drug, which really doesn't look like it does much for anybody, how that could actually impair research. So he doesn't want that kind of advocacy pressure. But on the other hand, advocacy pressure that is educated, is aligned with the best research, and is caring about patients is incredibly powerful. And I think this has helped the FDA align with patient groups that are educated like you and others. It aligns with the researchers who really want the FDA not to be stuck in the mud and say, we need a big phase 3 trial of 20,000 patients, which is easy to do in breast cancer and almost impossible to do in GIST. We can do randomized trials, but if you start honing down on specific groups of patients, if we had had to do a randomized blinded study of PDGF receptor mutant GIST patients, we would never have been able to develop avapritinib at Blueprint. I can guarantee you it never would have happened. The FDA recognized that the activity of avapritinib was breakthrough, and it got full approval on a non-randomized study just because it did so much. And I'm not trying to be promotional about that. I'm just trying to say the data were so clear that the FDA recognized it. And I respect them for doing that. It took some guts on their part. So again, this group, you have an important role to play. We're here, all of us, academics, doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, we're here to help educate you and stand arm to arm, arm in arm, as partners in this process. So I'd like to say thanks to all of you for showing up every day for what you do. And thanks for joining this meeting. And again, Sarah, Norman, Virginia, everybody else, thanks for inviting me.